Okay, hello everyone. This podcast will take you through the essay by Stephen Lee, the essay called How Authoritarian Was the Reich?" It's an essay taken from his first book, Imperial Germany, from the very first chapter. Okay, very useful essay this one, so let's go through it. Okay, first of all, by means of an introduction, the general theme throughout the essay is he's exploring whether the German Empire that was created in 1871, whether it was authoritarian, because obviously it was created by Prussia. So it's basically proposing the proposition the new German Empire was an authoritarian system, a top-down system, dominated and controlled by Berlin in every sense, or whether actually there were genuine liberal elements, okay, and liberal in the sense that there was real power that lay with the different regions, the different states of Germany, and also real power that lay with the people as opposed to just government by the elites. Okay, so that's the introduction. What he then does in the next two sections, sections B and C here, is Lee looks at the influences before 1871. Okay, so a little bit of background. Before Germany became a united country, okay, and first of all he says that there were definitely liberal influences in Germany. So if you take the separate German states, before Germany became united into one, many of them had progressive liberal constitutions that had been drafted by middle class lawyers, going back to the 1848 revolutions. I won't go back into the detail of the 1848 revolutions, but that was a liberalising revolution that resulted in a lot of power sharing, the upper classes having to give more power to the middle classes. Even Prussia itself, that we traditionally think before 1871, we traditionally think, well, Prussia was very authoritarian. Even Prussia itself, in 1850, there were constitutional changes, and the Prussian constitution was one of the most progressive in Europe. Following on from that, there was a wave of liberal reform in a package of measures, a programme called the New Era inside Prussia. Okay, so that's just to give it a bit of balance, and then again sticking on the theme before 1871. Of course, there were strong authoritarian influences before the unification, and in particular, obviously, the key argument is the Prussian system of government, especially under Bismarck, whose general aim was to preserve the elites, the Prussian Junkers, the traditional elites, in the face of those liberalising changes. So there's the background. Now then, of course, 1871, as we know, Prussia waged a war against France that resulted in the creation of the German Empire, which is the main focus of this essay. There's a useful quote there. Any quotes, by the way, unless it says otherwise, are by Stephen Lee. Okay, so the new Reich in 1871 had a split identity which mirrored that of Prussia, and which comprised elements of liberalism and authoritarianism. And basically, three interpretations. Some historians argue that the constitution of the empire was a proper consensus with genuine popular support, so liberal elements, and there was genuine power and influence, one from the German people, of all social classes, not just the Prussian elites, and secondly, to the separate states, okay, not just Prussia. So that's one end of the spectrum. That's the liberalising point of view. The opposite point of view is the historians who say actually that was just a pretense. It was a very reactionary constitution that simply gave Prussia control over the German states, that Germany was a constitution, the German constitution. That the German constitution basically was just Prussia enlarged. And the third point of view is the historians who argue that actually there was a balance somewhere in between those two different interpretations. Okay, so moving on to the next page. In the next section of the essay, Stephen Lee looks at the federal aspect of the Constitution, and again you can see basically what he does is he balances the liberal features against the authoritarian features. So it's an internal debate, okay, balancing these two features. So as we know, the German Empire was a federation. There were 25 different states. So what were the liberal features? Well, each of those 25 states, which included Prussia, retained its own ruler and government. So that in itself is liberalism. Okay, I mean obviously you contrast that to what Hitler did in 1934. He abolished the individual states and their rulers and their governments. So they were allowed to continue. So, for example, the Kingdom of Bavaria existed within the empire, and with its own King of Bavaria, and he had his own government, and he had his own legislature, the Bavarian state government, that was elected by the Bavarian people. Okay, so that in itself was liberalising. It was not all power lying with Berlin. Each of the 25 states also was represented in Berlin, okay, in its own organisation, the Bundesrat, and there was a fairness to the representation. The smaller states had one seat, the larger states had more. I think Bavaria had 6, Prussia had 17, being the largest of all the states. So as a result, the smaller states had some degree of self-rule, okay, especially the southern states of Baden, Bavaria and Württemberg. On the other hand, and this is the sort of direction of the essay, weighing one against the other, you could argue that the federal structure was authoritarian. Okay, the Prussian elites liked that federal system because it guaranteed the continued separate identity of Prussia. Prussia was not diluted, Prussia was not lost within the German Empire. So, for example, Prussia dominated the Bundesrat, that particular house that was there to represent the states, because she and the constitution guaranteed that she had the right of any veto of any constitutional change. So it basically meant that Prussia controlled the Bundesrat. Secondly, the members of the Bundesrat were appointed by the state rulers. They were not elected by the people of the state. So that in itself was a very top-down approach. So in practice, federalism meant that the Prussian government had indirect control of other states without being diluted by them. Again, that's a quote by Stephen Lee, so you can learn that one. So, for example, the King of Prussia was the Kaiser. The Minister President of Prussia was the Chancellor of the Empire. The Prussian civil service administered much of the empire. Okay, so it was very much dominated by Prussia. The Reich government, okay, the executive power, again, you could argue a liberal feature. The Reich government did not control some aspects of government, particularly education and direct taxation. They were controlled by the individual state governments. On the other hand, as you know, the Reich government was headed by the Kaiser, who alone was responsible for the appointment and dismissal of the Chancellor, so it was very much of a top-down government. There was no accountability by the Chancellor and his cabinet to the elected Reichstag, and there was no arrangement to make that to make the Chancellor accountable. The Reich executive was also very firmly in control of key aspects: foreign policy, the army and the navy. They were not controlled by the individual state governments, they were controlled by the Reich government. Next, the Reichstag, the legislative power of the empire. Again, you could argue there were liberal features. So, for example, the Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage. Legislation needed the assent of the Reichstag. Okay, so again, it was not all top down. It was not just the upper classes ruling the new Germany. The Reichstag controlled the military budget. The Reichstag was responsible for enacting a lot of social and constitutional reforms between 1871 and the end of the Reich in 1919. And the Reichstag proved itself more than capable on several occasions of opposing the chancellors, including taking on Bismarck on a number of occasions. On the other hand, it's quite easy to present a convincing case that the Reichstag's powers were fairly superficial. So, for example, the Reichstag had no formal influence over the creation of the Reich executive. When we say the Reich executive, that we mean by that the government of the empire. In other words, the cabinet, or the Kaiser plus the cabinet. The cabinet was appointed by the Kaiser. The Chancellor and the cabinet were accountable to the Kaiser. Okay, so that in itself took a lot of influence away from the Reichstag. There was also no tradition of party government in the Reich. That was an anomaly. Lots and lots of political parties. Okay, a nice little quote from Lee there. Nowhere else in Europe was there such a complete representation of the interests of the different sections of the population. So on one level, very, very progressive. You know, you've got the conservatives that represented the Prussian elites. You've got the social democrats that represent the working classes of Germany. But because they were deprived of any prospect of a share in government, the political parties therefore became very selfish in the way in which they worked. They pursued very narrow aims based on the voters for their party, which made it less likely that, quote by Lee, any genuinely party-based government would evolve. Okay, so you've therefore got, arguably, taking the synthesis approach, you've got a constitution that balances authoritarian features against liberal features, and that was the situation. But the argument here, of course, is, and this is where we're moving to the very last section, is that times were changing. In particular, there was industrialization. And that basically meant that the structure of the Reich needed to adapt as society moved on. A whole series of economic and social strains were appearing with industrialization. Of course, in particular, the creation of a large working class and the creation of a wealthier middle class. And effectively what that meant is that the political system, because it gave influence to the traditional social elites, was out of kilter with the changing times, and therefore the constitution needed to change with it. But it didn't. So what effectively was happening, therefore, the liberalism element should have been given a greater influence as society changed, but the authoritarianism was very entrenched. It was being challenged, but it refused to adapt. Now, the rulers of the Second Reich tried to resolve these tensions in two ways. Bismarck tried to maintain his authoritarian ascendancy by playing the political parties off against each other, which to a large extent he did very well. Kaiser Wilhelm II, of course, chose a different approach. His approach was Weltpolitik, the escape forward approach. by pursuing expansionist policies as a way of deliberately spreading nationalism to the lower classes to divert them away from their problems. Okay, and Lee finishes then with a nice little quote at the end. The underlying political culture was authoritarian, but the existence of liberal influences meant that authoritarianism was never autocratic, as in Russia under the Tsars. So, nice little distinction there. It was authoritarianism, but it was never autocracy because of the existence of those liberal features. Okay, thank you. I've got to stop there, just past the 15-minute mark.